Welcome back to the School of Muscle podcast. Today I have on JP to discuss a recent paper that he authored titled, "Should Competitive Bodybuilders Ingest More Protein Than Current Evidence-Based Recommendations?" So that's what we're going to kind of dive into today here, JP. And I think a good place for us to start is what kind of led you to wanting to do this kind of article in the first place?
Well, hi to everyone who are listening to us now, and thanks, Ryan, for having me here. First thing, I'm a co-author of this paper. The first author is Dr. Ribeiro, who was my previous co-supervisor. And he and my previous supervisor back in Brazil, they both were, before entering academia, they both were bodybuilder coaches. So in addition to that, at the time, I remember we were reading a lot about some reports on the literature about questionnaires used for bodybuilders to report their training style, nutrition strategies that bodybuilders often take. So we are we are noticing that there's difference in the recommendations for general population and even for trained subjects with what is done in practice by bodybuilders, or even anecdotes from what we see on the practice, like by ourselves, but also what literature reports about what are the practices that bodybuilders used to take. So in general, the recommendation and the practice used by bodybuilders are ingesting much more protein than the recommendation for untrained subjects or even for trained subjects. So we are talking a lot about that on that time, and then suddenly this Dr. Ribeiro started writing a thing, sent me a first draft and say, well, let's turn it into a proper paper, but I think we can't write a proper review about that because there isn't much literature around. So then we decided to write like an opinion paper, which is we have like different subjects, different topics around a common topic, but the main specific topic in this case, like we don't have any original paper that actually compare different amount of proteins between competitive bodybuilders. So we use the literature surrounding to write this paper, and then a bit of experience in practice to provide recommendations through the paper as well. The opinion paper, especially in this journal, the Sports Medicine Journal, it permits the authors to be more free. I mean, this kind of article permits a bit more of literary opinion on the topic, like instead of a review that deals with the current literature itself. So, yeah.
Gotcha. So you kind of saw this kind of disconnect between the evidence-based recommendations and when it comes to kind of protein intake and what people were kind of actually doing in practice. So you kind of wanted to write this opinion piece or opinion article on kind of these differences and whether kind of more advanced bodybuilders should be consuming more protein than what's currently recommended. And like, as you mentioned, this was more of an opinion article versus like a regular meta-analysis, correct? So you guys didn't actually have a certain inclusion criteria, have a bunch of studies, and then run statistics on that. It was more of a just kind of article, but also based on your guys's knowledge of the research, practical experience, and stuff like that. Does it sound like I'm getting that right?
Yeah, perfect. Like in terms of literature search, the difference between an opinion paper and this kind of paper we wrote with a proper systematic review, that we don't have necessarily to do a systematic search of the papers on the literature. But to be honest, like to write a paper of this kind of topic, we did a literature search in different databases using the keywords and all these things that would be included in a systematic review, but not in a very strict way, not using a predefined list of keywords that wouldn't, and by not doing that, we cannot call this as a systematic review. Plus, we didn't run any analysis to call this as a meta-analysis paper. We just went to, based on our opinion we have looking on practice, we did a search on the literature using different databases with common keywords like bodybuilder, resistance training, and protein and stuff. Gather all the papers together, read all of them, and start writing the paper.
Gotcha. So definitely very much so still based on the current literature and the current evidence, just not necessarily like a systematic review and going through the process of an inclusion criteria and stuff like that. So, not necessarily the same thing that you might see on like bodybuilding.com, to where it's literally just opinion based on experience. This was definitely still based on the current literature and several studies and stuff like that.
This is a paper in a peer-reviewed journal. It's published in a peer-reviewed journal. So different to a online article, like we went through peer review, and sometimes opinion papers take more. We have to delve in more into the topic, let's say, against the reviewers to prove our point, because it's not much fully proved by the science, by the research we have. It's our opinion itself. So we need to argue a lot against the reviewers to them get into the full and last version of the paper. So yeah, the peer review thing for opinion articles are pretty tough.
Yeah, so still a quite rigorous process to kind of actually get this paper published. It's not like you guys just threw this together based on opinion and it just, got published after that. Yeah. Cool. So with that, was there quite a bit of research that was out there for you guys to kind of look at and to kind of compare protein intakes of more kind of competitive trainees versus kind of these evidence-based recommendations? Or how was the kind of quality of research when you guys were kind of going through these studies and kind of reading about this more?
There are two types of papers that we went into the literature to provide this opinion paper. The first is the acute studies, where the researchers analyze the responses in muscle protein synthesis or net protein balance after different amounts of protein take per day. So much of the papers in, let's say, gym practitioners, trained gym practitioners, compared, for example, the current recommendation from the American Association of Dietetics, that is 1.2 versus, let's say, a higher intake of 1.6 versus a proper very high intake of above 2 or 2.2 grams per kilo of body mass per day, right? So, and much of these papers indicated that higher protein takes are better for a positive protein balance and for stimulating muscle protein synthesis. So this is the first clue. Like most of the papers that compare very high intakes in trained subjects indicated a positive effect favoring the high intakes. So, but the acute response not necessarily reflect the longitudinal response. So this is the second type of paper we look into, which is the training studies that took like where the researchers took like two or more groups of trained subjects, set them to a training program, a proper resistance training program, and compare different protein takes. So even annotated here, so one of the most important one we have in the literature is from Professor Hoffman, where they got strength and power. They call them as strength and power athletes, so probably power lifters and weightlifters, and set them to a 12-week resistance training program and compare three amounts of protein. So 1.2, which is the current recommendation, very low to be honest, 1.7 and 2.4. And what they found is that the changes after 12 weeks of training for the higher protein take, the moderate protein take, and the low protein take was 1 kilo, 0.7 kilo, and 0. So no change. So in this study, we can see that, like, for participants that train hard, not necessarily bodybuilders, the protein take is advantageous. also a lot of papers them from the group of Professor Jose Antonio compared very high protein intake, so 3.4, 4.4 grams per kilo of body mass per day. And much of these papers also observed an advantage for higher protein takes above 2 or 2.2, so very high protein takes. And also after, let's say, 2.2, 2.6 of protein take, probably most of the papers don't show an extra benefit for hypertrophy. But another point, which is very important for bodybuilding, of course, is the fat loss. Most of the papers that analyze the changes in body composition, not only hypertrophy, observed reduction in body fat. So it seems that not all nutrients, not all macronutrients are created equal. So taking one of the most important papers that is from Professor Jose Antonio compared isocaloric diets, so two different groups that ingested the same amount of calories, but one had a very high protein intake and a low carbohydrate intake, and the other had the opposite, a very high carbohydrate intake versus and a very low, not and a moderate protein intake. And after 8 weeks of training, they observed that the group that ingested more protein not only gained more muscle mass, but also lost more fat mass. So in general, the literature indicates that higher protein takes are better for the so-called muscle body recomposition, which is gain muscle and lose fat at the same time.
Gotcha. So when looking at both the acute studies, the kind of shorter term studies that looked at kind of like things like muscle protein, synthesis response and stuff like that, those suggested that a bit higher intakes led to these greater responses that, might lead you to say that over the long run, that leads to more muscle accrued. And then also more the longitudinal studies to where they put individuals through like 12-week programs also kind of suggested a similar path of, at least above the recommended 1.2 grams per kilo, going upwards of 2+ grams per kilo was beneficial for muscle growth. And then, like you said, for Dr. Jose Antonio, I've actually had him on the podcast and spoken with him about
so good
about these high protein diets and stuff. He also, like you said, has research to where going, I think it was like 3.5 grams per kilo. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but quite high, even higher than what most people would recommend, like the classic bodybuilding recommendation of 1 gram per pound. That's even higher than that. So he saw benefits of not only kind of better muscle growth, but also fat loss and stuff like that. So does that sound like a pretty good kind of summary of what you guys found, what kind of these articles suggested?
Yeah, this paper for Jose Antonio, the participants that gained muscle mass and lost fat mass was 3.4. So it's interesting to see, for example, if you look into the literature for the past 20 years, the standard recommendation for normal population, like those who are not even training, like doing any exercise, the minimum recommendation for maintaining muscle mass is 0.8 of grams of protein per kilo of body weight per day. And for those who are exercising, the recommendation is 1.2. Then in 2016 or 17, the Rob Morton, a student from Professor Stuart Phillips in Canada, they gathered with Alan Aragon, Professor Brad Schoenfeld, and other guys that are into this topic a lot, and wrote a proper systematic review with meta-analysis, with meta-regression, like gathering 50 papers on the literature with that analyzed the effects of protein supplementations into people that are performing resistance training. And what they found, and this was a very important mark into the literature because of the size and the amount of subjects into the paper, that 1.6 is like the right spot for people who are training. And after that, they suggested that there is no further increase in muscle mass. Or in other words, for those who are performing resistance training, at the minimum of protein intake that is recommended is 1.6. After that, there is no further increase in muscle mass. But the confidence interval in statistical terms, like what are the limits that this 1.6 gram are valid, it's from 1.1 to 2.2. So this is another thing like we look at into. So if the recommendation is 1.6 and the upper limit of this recommendation is 2.2, at least those who are trained a bit harder should intake the 2.2. So should take into consideration the 2.2. So I mean, for normal people that are training, 2.2 is the maximum. But if I'm training a bit harder, or in other words, if I'm turning into a bodybuilding or participating, like taking bodybuilding to my life, not necessarily you are a professional bodybuilder, but like you are following all the stuff that the bodybuilders do, you may, why then choose the minimum? Like why choose the minimum of the confidence interval 1.1? So we recommend at least 2.2 should be ingested for competitive bodybuilders. Well, just another thing. When the difference then between, one may wonder that what's the difference then strength athletes or normal gym practitioners and bodybuilders. So why would we recommend that bodybuilders shouldn't take more? What's the difference between them? So a few things we could notice, and then these provide basis for our recommendations for bodybuilders to ingest more protein. Is that first, bodybuilders tend to enter into caloric deficit for longer times, which is the thing that people in general don't do. So bodybuilders who are into caloric deficit, so the cutting phase, are suggested to increase even more protein. So probably from 2.2, 2.5 up to 3 grams of protein. And depending on the severity of the caloric deficit, there are a few papers in the literature suggesting that even 4 grams per kilo of body mass per day should be used as a way to keep the body mass. I mean, the objective during a cutting is to at least preserve the muscle mass, right? So a higher protein take would be better, because not only the idea of increasing the protein intake is to provide sufficient protein to the muscle to be restored and kept at the same level, but also to, let's say, block the protein breakdown that is increased when we are in a caloric deficit. So there are a few mechanisms that suggest that during a caloric deficit, our body tends to use more protein for keep the energy, like let's say, to keep the energy at ideal levels for us to do our activities during the day. So if we are using more protein for other stuff, for energy use, just by doing that, we need them to increase the protein take and use this extra protein take for energy. But there's another point we pointed into the article, and actually this probably will be the topic for our next paper into this, is the main difference between gym practitioners and strength athletes and bodybuilders is that bodybuilders train way more harder, especially in terms of volume of training. So some even say that the difference between a power lifter and a bodybuilder is the volume they carry. So uh, both training at higher levels, high intensity levels. I'm not saying that. Please, I'm not saying that power lifters train puffy. Okay, train low intensity, but the difference between is that bodybuilders tend to train at very high levels of training volume. Sorry, very high levels of training volume. So if we consider that higher training volumes is increasing the stimulus to the muscle, leading to higher muscle damage, we may suggest then that the protein breakdown would be increased. So, regardless of doing more damage stimulus to the muscle is good or not for hypertrophy, okay? We all know that bodybuilders train mostly focusing on very high intensity, always feeling soreness into the muscles and this kind of thing. So at least to repair the extra damage that they are used to have during training sessions, a higher protein take would be necessary. So uh, instead of instead of trying to preserve muscle mass during cutting, bodybuilders uh, may also be in advantage of using high protein takes. Let's say above 2.5, above 3.0 grams per kilo of body weight per day. Also because of the higher training volumes they used to carry.
Gotcha. So, two of the core reasons why a bodybuilder specifically might need more protein than just like the average person that's like active or something like that is because of they tend to be in these calorie deficits more, and protein can kind of help with the muscle retention throughout a calorie deficit. And then also because of their higher training volumes and maybe incurring a bit more muscle damage and using that protein for repair, growth, and stuff like that. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, perfect.
Awesome. So I think that gives like a couple of nice takeaways from your guys's paper here. Are there any other kind of core takeaways that you kind of wanted to leave people with when reading this paper, or some recommendations that people should keep in mind when thinking about their own programs and what to do with like their protein intake, or maybe when coaching other people? What are maybe some kind of practical takeaways from your guys's paper here?
The main point is that we are showing that the literature and what is doing in practice differs a bit. So, using the literature surrounding the topic, we suggest that bodybuilders or people that training or that probably used to train harder than normal people may be in advantage of while using higher protein takes. Especially, we also mentioned that for those who are in caloric deficit in a cutting diet may also be favored for the use of higher protein takes. And depending on the severity of the calorie deficit, this may scales up to even higher protein takes.
Gotcha. So to me, I think one of the really core takeaways is that, generally the initial recommendation is like 1.2 grams per kilo. But as you guys mentioned in this article, really that minimum should be like 1.6 grams per kilo. And that's even like a minimum. You should probably even err on the side of like 2 grams per kilo. And then maybe if you're going through a calorie deficit, or if you are particularly doing quite a bit of training volume and maybe going through an overreaching phase or something like that, maybe you even kind of scale that protein a little bit higher and head towards 3 grams per kilo, or even a little bit higher, as in Dr. Jose Antonio's studies that suggested a bit higher could be beneficial. Does that sound like a fair takeaway when it comes to kind of like dosages of protein?
Yeah, perfect. We suggest that at least 2.2 should be necessary for competitive bodybuilders as a protein take. And this can change from the bulking phase to the cutting phase, while in the cutting phase, bodybuilders may consider increasing even more the protein take, scaling this for 3.0, 4.0 grams per kilo for body weight per day. Yeah.
And I believe the study was published a few years ago. So has anything kind of changed between the time that you guys published this opinion article and here sitting in 2023? Has any other evidence that have come out suggesting that those protein intakes should be different, or does kind of your general recommendation still stand?
The recommendations still stand. Like I see the advantage on the recent few years is that on the type of protein source. So most of recent papers that are indicating that the protein source doesn't matter much if you are taking animal or veggie proteins. So I would like to say the literature is adding to the topic that if you are considering having higher protein takes, doesn't matter if you are having by animal or vegetable protein sources. But still, I think the amount of protein is still the same on the past for the recommendations we had in 2019.
Perfect. Well, I think with that, JP, that gives a really good kind of understanding of what you guys did in this article, practical takeaways, and whether anything has changed. And as you just mentioned, not really. If anything, it just kind of added to your guys' recommendations. So I think with that, if people want to kind of stay up to date with what you're doing, like any upcoming articles that you have on, they want to see those come out, where can people is there anywhere people can go to kind of follow you online and make sure that they're kind of staying up to date with anything that you're doing?
Yeah, I'm not too much into social medias, but I sometimes I share a few things on my day-by-day research here on my Instagram and on Twitter. You may find me by my full name is João Pedro Nunes, or even JP Nunes. You may find me elsewhere. We are doing also research on resistance training and stuff. Not much into the protein anymore. While back in Brazil, we are doing something, but here in Australia, while I'm doing my PhD, I'm more focused on the resistance training thing. Also, I see that I will probably publish something about protein taking bodybuilders in the next few months, because me and my previous co-supervisor are talking a lot about that again. And I hope in the near future we can see some advances on the topic, changing these recent paradigms on the recent few years, comparing, for example, high versus low training volumes and high versus low protein takes. Let's say 4 groups, one group having high protein take, another group having low protein take, and within these 2 groups, subjects training more or more or less volume, to see how training volume impacts how training volume interacts with protein take. Let's say people who are doing more strenuous exercise, more damaging exercises, or even more very, very high training volume, maybe benefit for higher protein takes than people who are just lifting light weights or not much high training volumes. I think that will be pretty cool. And as soon as we are writing something about that. It's again a opinion paper. As soon as we get that, I'll be very happy to share with you on the first hand.
Awesome. Well, I will definitely be looking forward to that. And once that does get published, I'll definitely have you back on to kind of discuss the kind of outcomes that you guys find, as I think that's kind of one thing that we discussed today was that, hey, if you're doing a lot of training volume, you might want to scale your protein up a little bit to account for that. So it'd be really cool to see a actual published paper on this topic.
Just adding another thing that would be very cool to see. I think this might be pretty difficult to test around the world. Like, it's about bodybuilders ingesting heavy anabolic steroids. So we know that people who take anabolic steroids have higher expression of satellite cells, myonuclear addition to the muscle, and we may say that the muscle machinery is improving. which is one of the reasons that explain why bodybuilders or people who are taking steroids gain muscle much faster than normal people who are natural. So I hope we can see something in the near future, let's say an acute paper, comparing bodybuilders who are taking steroids versus natural bodybuilders. And also in the long term, probably we can see some paper comparing very, very high protein takes in bodybuilders. Let's say if the machinery is improved, like uh, the ribosomes and also the satellite cells proliferation and all the things is favoring the muscle accretion. So the protein take may need to follow the improvement in the machinery. So probably bodybuilders having ingesting anabolic steroids may be benefit for even higher protein takes, which is actually also one of the things we see in the practice, and a few papers reported as well that professional bodybuilders using steroids tend to ingest like above 4 grams per kilo of body weight per day, easy. So, but this still needs to be proven by the science. We'll see.
Yeah, that would be super interesting, as I know that, growing up, paid attention to some of these bodybuilders, you'd see that they're eating like 300 to 400 grams of protein per day. And I almost feel like once I got into more the evidence-based community, so to speak, people almost like laughed at those protein intakes as like way too high and stuff like that. But as you mentioned, if their muscle building machinery is just that much ramped up and they can actually utilize those proteins that they're ingesting, they might have actually been onto something with those kind of higher protein intakes.
And to be very honest, I'm saying as a guy starting to science, why we don't have evidence to that, the last opinion is from the coaches. So the coaches are used to test different things on practicing their athletes. So if the current scenario is bodybuilders ingesting above 3.0 per day, there might be a reason. It's not out of nothing. Like probably not. I'm sure that after years and years of practice and testing, the coaches realized that higher protein takes is even better for competitive bodybuilders using steroids.
This is kind of a pattern that we've definitely seen before with, bodybuilders kind of doing something that the evidence really hasn't kind of shown yet. And then it kind of ends up catching up to kind of their practices and stuff. And, that's not to say everything that a professional bodybuilder does is something that will be backed by evidence, but they often do kind of lead the way a little bit. So I think that'll definitely be interesting to kind of look at.
I would love to share a few things. If there's something coming around on the literature, I'll be the first to share on your email. So, well, one of the things that is about that, about the thing about foot positioning for inner calves, outer calves. This was one of the things that we already analyzed in our group back in Brazil. So this is a paper we run in 2018, 2019, and where we compared in detrained subjects, I mean, people who already has a training background but wasn't training for a while. We compared the foot position for calf raise exercise, foot point outward, foot point forward, and foot point inward. And after 10 weeks of training, we observed that the things bodybuilders were doing like decades ago, it seems to be right. Like we observed that by doing calf raise exercise with feet pointed outward, improved more the gastrocnemius medialis, while with the feet point inward, increased more the thickness of the gastrocnemius lateralis, and the foot pointed forward led to a balance of response. So same response between both gastrocs. And it's pretty cool to see that this actually may occur, like, and I hope we can see the same pattern for other things that are doing practice for bodybuilders for years, that led into the science. The science, like say, I don't like the use of say the word proves, but the science proves what they are doing back before. And this we can improve in them back again, the practice of bodybuilders. It's interesting to see even that this foot positioning thing is already being used in practice for rehabilitation of Achilles tendon. So we have subdivisions of Achilles tendon depending on the head of the gastroc. And I have a mate here who is a physiotherapist, and he's saying, mate, I'm doing this different foot positioning thing for targeting subtendons of the gastrocnemius, and it's working. Like if we can identify which subtendon is more affected, and we can target the training for it specifically, like why not? And then I said, well, it's interesting to see that it came from the bodybuilders. So I like this kind of stuff. Anyway, we could stay here talking hours.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And, a very timely kind of example of this is kind of the weighted stretching stuff, to where there's now started to be a bit more evidence on weighted stretching being beneficial for hypertrophy. And for a long time, like professional bodybuilders would be extending their sets with like partial reps in that weighted position. And it's like, they might have been onto something there. So I think, as you mentioned, there's probably several examples that we could go on for another hour here talking about. But I'll let you go here, JP. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciated it, and I'm definitely looking forward to more discussions once you guys kind of publish more stuff or different research comes out.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. It was really nice to talk about this stuff. I love science. I love bodybuilding. Having the opportunity to do both together, it's amazing. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you.